Soon it would be at the clearing. Suddenly it was there before him. He could see himself. He shifted his eyes carefully to look at it. He saw the killer. The killer saw him. He saw the killer see him, and knew the killer could see himself, too. "Well, well, here we are again at last," the monstrous man said in his familiar accent. Rob stared at him and himself in his new whacked-out disoriento vision with shock. You're here?" The killer blinked his eyes hard a couple of times. Rob saw his own vision stabilize for the brief moments during those blinks. "Man, that is really annoying." The killer rubbed his eyes with his index finger and his thumb. That gave Rob enough clear sight time to leap off the tree trunk and at least get himself on his feet. The killer shook his head and said, Fuck it. It's the last annoying thing you are going to cause me." The malformed man studied Rob as best as he could with the way he could see. "Weren't you expecting me? I didn't expect nothing formal, but you got me feeling a bit overdressed." He bellowed a hoarse and frightening laugh. Rob just stood his ground. It would do him no good to run. The man was faster and stronger. That was just the way it was. He looked around as well as he could to try to come up with a plan, any plan. He put his hand to his forehead out of frustration. He began rubbing it and biting his lip. He felt so stupid under his terror. How could he not have thought this part through? What had he expected to happen? He had thought there would be more time. As a desperate stalling device, he asked, "How did you find me?" Well, the killer mocked, "maybe I wouldn't have been able to if you would have been smart enough to leave me alone for 5 goddamn seconds." "I didn't mean for any of this." "What about what you're doing right fucking now?" the killer roared and stomped towards him. Rob flinched and brought his arms in reflexively to cover his own chest with his fists. He wasn't worried about modesty. He was more concerned with his own mortality. The killer stopped right in front of Rob and brought his right arm back, clenched his fingers, and punched Rob right in the middle of his face with the bottom of his palm. Rob saw blackness and felt the air around his body as he flew back into the rock-hard trunk. He crashed into it with his back and collapsed to the ground in a heap. He grunted and still felt the pressure from the blow on his face. He got on his hands and knees. "I'm not doing this. I'm not doing any of it, I swear." "Don't beg. Not yet. It's too easy and it's been too long a-comin'. What happened to the tough guy bullshit? That went away real fast, didn't it? You sorry? Huh?" Rob felt his spine pop as he tried to stand up. He righted himself but wobbled on his feet from both the injuries and the vision. It was risky, but he closed his eyes to steady himself. He really didn't feel as if he had a choice. "That's right. Don't you want to die on your feet like a man?" Rob opened his eyes and saw how pathetic he looked compared to the image his own eyes were providing to the both of them. He stopped himself. He had already lost right there in that thought. No, it would not end like that. He sniffed angrily through his nostrils. That was good. He wanted himself to get madder. "Fuck you," he mustered. He went to wipe the blood away from his nose, but there was no blood there. That's right. He had a secret. "There you go. Now you're ready to go on to the flames. Yeah, that's where little fuckers like you go, right into the fire. I'm going to send you there screaming." The killer began to advance on Rob again when he stopped. "Hoo-wee!" He waved his hand in front of his face. "What the hell is that stench? Is that you?" He looked at the ground and saw the flies having a field day in the pile of puke. It was much fresher than the other pile. Did I step in that?" He looked down at his boots. They were clean. "Good thing for you. God damn, son, what have you been doing out here?" Rob rushed at him. He had no plan of attack. He just had enough, and he went for it. He clocked the killer in the face with his right fist. The killer's head turned with the blow. Rob kicked him in the stomach. The killer backhanded Rob with his left arm to swat him away. Rob landed on the ground several yards out. The buzzing flies abandoned their banquet and quickly returned to it when they realized that they were not involved. "Well done, boy, but that's all you're gonna get. I let this go on long enough. Frankly, I'd just kill you to get you to stop messing with my eyes. How are you doing that?" "How dense are you, you stupid cocksucker?" The killer gnashed his tiny, jagged teeth. "Maybe I am a bit for letting you live this long." It just jumped into Rob's head. "That's why you're a cocksucker?" The killer's snarl went lax. His lips covered his teeth back up. He stared blankly at Rob, and at himself through Rob's eyes. Rob looked around frantically and tried to focus his eyes. An escape plan still seemed like no good. How far would he get with double vision half blinding him? He saw the giant's finger bone on the ground next to him. Dirt was clumped to it where he had stirred the mixture with it. He grabbed it up in his right hand. After a long pause, the killer let out the loudest and most guttural laugh. He actually put his hands on his undulating belly as he uproariously laughed to the sky. He closed his eyes so he could thoroughly enjoy the moment. Rob lunged at him again. He was holding the stick at the base and wielding it as if he were going to stab down with it like a butcher knife. He logically knew that he could not puncture the skin of the monster man, but he felt more empowered with a weapon in his hand. He was running at him on pure instinct. That instinct would tell him what to do when it was time. Time was only a matter of milliseconds away. The killer effortlessly snatched him up by the throat and lifted him off the ground. He took the punches to the face with mild irritation. He plain ignored the kicks to his legs. Those he barely even felt. The boy's hand that was holding the rock stick had a bit more impact from the weight of the stone. Still, the killer just bore it and moved his head a bit to avoid most of the direct impact. Rob felt his breath halt as soon as he was picked up. He punched and kicked all that he could, but it did not seem to have much of an effect. The killer studied him up and down. "You really are a nasty little shit. Just look at you. What the fuck is wrong with you?" There was an expression of disgust on his face from the sight and smell of the boy. He stared on further as he saw himself through the boy's eyes. It was an unbiased image of what he really looked like. His own eyesight made it hard to fully focus on what he saw. He disregarded the image of the boy and directed his attention to his own. He was fascinated, but a little disturbed. He certainly looked badass and mean, but he was ugly too. He had been okay to look at once. Seeing yourself in a mirror let you still put a little comfortable delusion on the flipped and sometimes slightly distorted image, but he knew that these eyes were not lying at all. They saw him as he really was, and he saw it too, for what felt like the first time. He tried to remember what he had looked like before. It was not that long ago, but it sure felt like it. He saw the boy's face too. There was something off about it. He then realized what it was. He had lots of practice at bashing people's faces in, and that was what he had intended from his first punch. He forgot that he had meant it to be debilitating, so that he could slowly and methodically rip the boy limb from limb. All the distraction of his messed-up vision and the fact that the interaction was finally happening made him forget. He had honed in on him somehow the night before. The feeling of where he was had hit him suddenly and strongly. He had just played the warmer, colder game with it until he was burning hot on the right path. Then, just a ways back, his eyesight had gone all crazy on him. The boy had done something to make that happen. When he re-examined the boy's face, he knew what that thing was. "Oh my," he laughed at him. "You are really onto something now." He saw his own face fading away. He shook the boy by the throat. No. Don't you go on me just like that. Not just yet." Rob felt his body struggling for oxygen. He was losing consciousness. His new abilities were supposed to make him almost invulnerable. Was strangulation really the way he was going to go out? Was that really all it took? His skin was supposed to be impenetrable, but that would not help him here. He felt like a small, great white shark had him in its jaws by the throat, but it could not puncture him because he was wearing one of those suits made from chain mesh. The teeth could not puncture him, but they could simply crush him to death with their tremendous force. He was nowhere near that strong, not yet, and maybe that day would never come. He gasped for air, but none would enter his throat and go on into his lungs. The killer was saying something to him, but he didn't really hear it. He was fading. The killer was shaking him. In that moment, he managed to get just a little air. It was not much, but it was enough. All of his survival instinct kicked in. He brought up the hand that had the stick in it. He plunged it with all his might into the killer's left eye. He didn't really know if it would do any good, but if it could just get him to let go for a little while so he could breathe, then it was worth doing. He felt the stone stick hit the eyeball, but it did not pop it. It slid the eye out of its way from the force of Rob's new strength. Maybe he really had some after all. He ground the stick in the socket. The eye popped out from between the lids and lay on the killer's cheekbone. Rob was dropped. His feet hit the ground, but he did not let go. He heard the killer's faint screams grow louder and louder as he regained full consciousness. They were deafening, but they were also encouraging. The killer fell backwards and landed with a mighty thud that seemed to shake the earth. Rob still did not let go. He stayed on him. He continued grinding the stick in the socket until the tip of it got stuck in the superior orbital fissure. Rob remembered that as the hole in the back of the eye socket that the optic nerve travels through and attaches to the brain. Biology class had been good for something after all. He continued to apply pressure, all that he could, while the killer randomly bucked below him like some wild bronco. Rob was lasting much longer than 8 seconds on him. He was determined to dig that stick as deep into the killer's skull as he could. Maybe that would tame him. He wrenched the stick back and forth until he felt and heard a cracking sound, like someone had snapped a pencil. The area he had to grind the stick into had widened. He yanked the stick downward, hard and fast, sending the tip of the stick upward and into the killer's brain. He felt the thick but yielding consistency. It was like trying to stir the meat in a can of Spam. The killer's screaming stopped. His bucking stopped. He lay motionless. Rob's vision snapped back into crystal clarity, and the humming that was in his head, that he hadn't even noticed after getting used to it, and in the distraction of all that was happening, instantly stopped. He saw the forest around the clearing, lit by the light of approaching dusk. He heard the crickets start chirping their chaotic but musical tune. Maybe it was a song of celebration. The killer was dead. Rob kept waiting for the killer to gasp and suddenly get up and come after him. The injuries didn't look so severe on the outside, considering how strong he was. It was just a stick in the eye. It filled the socket and stuck out about a foot. It weighed his head over to the left side. His other eye was just fine, though. The rest of his body looked to be as well. He could still get up at any time. Could it really be all over? Rob replayed the sensation of crushing the killer's brain with the stick over and over, until it felt like he might really have done some permanent damage. Just because the skin was indestructible didn't mean the skeleton was, too, obviously. He had snapped the skull bone behind the eye like the world's toughest eggshell. If the killer had just been able to survive it for even a moment or two, he may have been able to access the involuntary and almost miraculous healing abilities, and maybe he could have been completely restored. He could have even just popped the eye back into place for sure. It was still attached. The killer hadn't had a chance to rejuvenate, though. Not at all. Rob had accessed his own internal abilities and instincts. He had been relentless. He had destroyed the brain and killed the monster, just like a zombie in almost any zombie movie. How could it have been that simple? Well, it really hadn't been that easy, he realized. Why wasn't that listed as a weakness in the book with a diagram and everything? He could have just shot him in the eye. Maybe the poison and the toxic gas theories were still valid, too. He had gotten to a vital organ, and that had been all she wrote. Maybe he could make his own handwritten addition to the great book. The very idea made him feel humbled. Another thought occurred to him. Maybe it took a monster to kill a monster. That thought was less humbling and was more disquieting. He felt creeped out enough for goosebumps to break out all over, but no goosebumps rose up. He sat and stared at the killer's corpse until it was almost dark. He really was dead, and he was going to stay that way. He wondered if he shouldn't do with the corpse what he planned on, and thought that maybe he should just bury him instead, so no one would pull the stick out. Would he be able to resurrect himself and heal then? Would the power do it automatically for him? Rob realized that was the line. There was something mystical to all of it, but there was a kind of logic to it as well. The book had mentioned great healing abilities, but it did not go so far as resurrection. That was a whole other ballgame. Certainly he could believe in the healing, but what's dead is dead, and there is no recovery from that. It was truly the end for the killer. Rob made himself get comfortable with that fact. Then he gathered more wood for another fire. His back hurt like hell every time he bent over to add sticks to the pile that was rising bit by bit in his arms, with each addition poking him in the chest as he cradled it. He wondered how bad his back would hurt if he had not done what he had done the night before. He wondered if he would even be alive to wonder. He shrugged and supposed not. He got the fire lit, and then began the next step in his plan. The seemingly endless task was looking to be finite after all. He was nearing the end. The next steps would be the easy part. It was always the part of his checklist that he considered overly presumptuous to even have. Surely he would not survive a direct and sustained attack from the killer, let alone defeat and kill him. He had, though. That step had come and gone. He wished he had made an actual list on paper to check things off as he accomplished them. He would have written simply, "Kill killer. Check. Next."